Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon. Wow, another year is coming to a close pretty soon. That is bonkers. It seems like just last week that I was starting this YouTube channel. But I checked my calendar and last week was nowhere close to when I started this YouTube channel. Time speeds up as we get older. It's one of the cruelties of aging. Anyway, woe is me, etc. But you're not here to listen to me gripe about my perception of time. You're here because I'm promising to put 20 JRPGs from the last 4 calendar years in a specific order and tell you which one is the very, very best. And I'm happy to oblige. Before we dive in though, would you consider subscribing if you like JRPGs? And please be sure to like the video if you enjoy it. And personally, I'd love to hear your favorite JRPGs from the first 4 years of the 20s, so let me know down in the comments. All right, moving on. The past few years have been packed with RPGs, and honestly, it's been hard to keep up. It's such a different environment from the one I grew up in. Back then, even 2 great RPGs in a year was something to celebrate. But now we're regularly seeing between 5 and 10 fantastic titles a year, not to mention a plethora of more middle-of-the-road games. Good grief, I sounded like 100 years old there. In my day, we were lucky to get 1 video game for Christmas. You kids are spoiled. Anyway, so maybe it would be helpful to have someone like me narrow down the options for you. These are 20 JRPGs I've played that have come out since the beginning of 2020. Keep in mind, their inclusion on this list at all already places them in a pretty impressive category. Just because a game is number 19 or 20 on this list doesn't mean it's bad. I only chose games for this list that I genuinely enjoy. But anyway, enough preamble. Let's get to the amble. Octopath Traveler was a paradigm-shifting game. It came along early in the Switch's life, and it showed the world that we were still into classic-style RPGs, so long as developers put in the effort to make them good. It didn't hurt that the art style Square Enix created for it was eye-poppingly amazing. Octopath Traveler was far from a perfect game, but it did enough right and found enough success that Square quickly greenlit a sequel that aimed to address all of the fan complaints about the first. And so, we have Octopath Traveler 2. By and large, OT2 is a significant improvement over the original. The graphics are still gorgeous, the music is equally beautifully grand, and the characters are as interesting as ever. You have 8 unique heroes who join together, and they each have their own unique story. You can choose to experience them in basically any order you want, and in between major story events, you can take part in mini-quests that involve 2 of your characters together. The battle system is completely turn-based in that old-school way, but it's full of enough visual flair and modern sensibilities to keep it engaging throughout. The Octopath series is proving to be one of the most enjoyable throwbacks to the bygone days of JRPGs that we have. And if we're lucky, Square Enix will keep them coming for a long time. If you were like me, and you basically missed the introduction to this epic and amazing series when it first released on the Nintendo Wii, then you were probably thrilled to get a chance to experience it on the Switch. I know I was. Here was Tetsuya Takahashi, the creator of Xenogears and the Xenosaga games, launching a brand new series that was going to carry on the name and the themes of his past titles. And it involved people living on the bodies of 2 enormous titans. That's pretty dang unique, if you ask me. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition smooths off most of the rough edges from the original and makes this by far the best way to play this game. Some things didn't really need smoothing though, like the epic soundtrack and the incredible story. If you were expecting great things from Takahashi's newest series, you weren't going to be disappointed. This is an epically long game with so much to do that it might occasionally seem overwhelming. But if you stick it out, you're in for a truly memorable time that sets up an incredible series. If you have a strong aversion to gacha games, look, I get it. I've always had a pretty big issue with them too. But please believe me when I tell you that you can play Honkai Star Rail without spending a dime and still get a fantastic turn-based JRPG experience that really and truly feels AAA. Like the game that came before it, Genshin Impact, Honkai Star Rail has all the charm of a title that might be published by a company like NIS America, but with the budget of a game from Square Enix or Capcom. Riding your space train through the cosmos and saving planets from destruction, all the while trying to understand the mysteries of your own past, makes for a pretty engaging story too. And the gameplay really shines. If it has a fault, it's that there are a lot of elements of gacha design that seem a bit unnecessary, particularly if you're not looking to play it as a gacha. Leveling up isn't as simple as just fighting in enough battles to increase your experience, for example. But those more gacha-y elements are easy enough to learn, and you'll be enjoying yourself enough in the rest of the game that they'll be easy to overlook too. Look, video games are expensive, and especially around this time of year, a lot of people are kinda cash-strapped. Give your wallet a break, and try Honkai Star Rail. I wouldn't normally consider this game for a list like this, since it's a light remaster of a much older game, but the inclusion of the first ever official localized version of Radical Dreamers makes it eligible as far as I'm concerned. Okay, maybe that's just an excuse to talk about Chrono Cross, which is one of the most interesting games ever made. As a sequel to Chrono Trigger, it's not great. I mean, that's not to say it's not a great game, just that it doesn't do what most people would want a Chrono Trigger sequel to do. It broke out boldly in its own direction, and it created one of the premier JRPGs on the PS1. The music alone on this one, man. If Chrono Cross divides the fanbase on every other aspect of its design, the one thing everybody agrees on is that the music is incredible. Yasunori Mitsuda returns from Chrono Trigger and puts out one of the best albums of music ever. It's got everything. Hardcore battle themes, peaceful island songs, heartfelt piano pieces. The opening song, Time Scar, is still one of the best video game songs ever composed, and the game is almost 25 years old. This remaster smooths over the graphics a decent bit, and while it's never going to look great, PS1 didn't really lend itself to beautiful visuals, I'd say it's not all that hard on the eyes either. And I'm thrilled that we finally received a legitimate English rendition of Radical Dreamers, the sort of sequel to Chrono Trigger that was stuck in Japanese Satellaview land for ages. I mean, if you don't know about it, don't get your hopes up. It's a pretty straightforward text-based adventure game. But still, we finally have it. As a Chrono fan, I'm so glad that this release happened, and I hope it's encouraging Square Enix to consider revisiting the Chrono series in some way. Team Asano is the group behind Octopath Traveler, and if Octopath is carrying on the legacy of games like Live Alive and Saga, then Bravely Default is carrying on the legacy of Final Fantasy. For everyone who bemoans the end of traditional turn-based Final Fantasy games, just take a look at Bravely Default. Turn-based combat, classic Final Fantasy job system, a party of 4 characters saving the world from evil. It takes all that was great about classic FF games and turns the dial all the way up. Bravely Default 2 carries on the legacy by taking place in a completely different world than the first game, so you don't have to worry that you're missing anything if you start here. This is the epitome of classic gameplay mixed with modern convenience. The ability to speed up battles alone is a godsend for grinding sessions. The graphics look simple at first glance, but there are layers of depth to the backgrounds with gorgeous visual effects that really showcase the design. And the characters are charming as heck and really interesting, not to mention that the voice performances are all excellent. I'm glad that Square Enix hasn't completely said goodbye to their older style of games, and that Bravely Default could exist right alongside Final Fantasy as a reminder of those times. The Tales series has been a consistent force in JRPGs for a long time, going all the way back to the Super Famicom. And while it's definitely evolved over that time, for the most part, you had a pretty good idea of what to expect from the gameplay of each new Tales title. Tales of Arise, though, represents the biggest shift in gameplay the series has ever seen. These games have always had frantic action, but never to this level. Arise follows Alphen, a slave who can't feel pain, and a sort of aristocrat woman named Shion, who's cursed so that anyone who touches her feels nothing but pain. It's like they're a match made in heaven, isn't it? But really, this story goes some places, and even more than in some past Tales games, I was never quite sure what to expect next. Story aside, the action is where it's at with this one. The battles are so frenetic, and there's an immense cool factor to the whole proceeding. It's a real challenge, too, without becoming overly frustrating. If you're curious about the Tales of games and you're wondering where you should jump in, there's nothing wrong with grabbing this one and giving it a try. If you're a modern JRPG fan, I think you're gonna like it. I poured almost exactly 100 hours into Persona 5 Unroyal. Non-royal. the original one. The time flew by too because I was so into everything that was happening. The story was engaging from the start, the turn-based combat was super fun, and even the freaking user interface just made the game feel so friggin' cool. Much like Atlas did with Persona 3 and Persona 4, giving us Persona 3 FES and Persona 4 Golden respectively, they decided to dip into the Persona 5 waters again with a small update. Well, I say small, but really this is a meaty mass of changes. In addition to an entirely new character who joins the Phantom Thieves, you get a whole new plotline, assuming that you meet the prerequisites throughout the main game. I'd check a guide to be sure you do everything right, if I were you, unless you don't mind dumping another $100 into this. Royal is by far the definitive version of Persona 5. And look, if I'm being 100% honest, I do kind of wish Atlas would just, make this version of the game in the first place, right? Make the definitive version the only version. But they like money, I guess. And so, here we are. But because Royal is so clearly the best version of the game, it makes it very easy to recommend it to newcomers. If you're into RPGs with a modern setting, awesome characters, and a freaking epic battle system, then Persona 5 Royal needs to be on your shelf. Square Enix has been slowly but surely righting the wrongs of its past. One of those wrongs was keeping Live Alive from us back on the Super Nintendo. This remake uses the Team Asano HD 2D style, and it's a gorgeous recreation of this classic. It's finally getting the full audience it deserved way back when. Live Alive is similar to games like Octopath Traveler and the Saga series in that you have multiple protagonists, though in this case their paths don't really cross. Each character's story is its own thing, a sort of mini RPG in and of itself. You have everything from a caveman trying to save a girl from an evil T-Rex, to a modern-day Street Fighter who wants to be the very best like no one ever was, all the way to an adorable robot in the distant future on board a spaceship. The characters and their stories really sell this game and make each chapter super compelling. The gameplay involves battling on a sort of grid where you can move your characters into position to launch special attacks. It's a lot of fun, but the stories are what really drove me in this one. If you're into JRPGs and you don't mind something a bit different, definitely check out Live Alive. Persona 5 Strikers is the action RPG follow-up to Persona 5, and contrary to what some feared leading up to its release, it is, in fact, a full-on sequel to Persona 5 in every meaningful way. Gang is back together and going on a road trip, and along the way, they naturally get sucked into more metaverse shenanigans and have to battle wave after wave of shadows. Strikers is definitely a Musou game, basically meaning that it plays similarly to games like Dynasty Warriors, where your hero character is swarmed by hundreds of enemies, and yet you never feel like you're going to be overpowered. You can unleash freaking epic Persona attacks on everything in sight, and it's just so satisfying to watch entire hordes of enemies get wiped out all at once. Getting to spend more time with the Phantom Thieves is worth the price of admission alone. This is one of my favorite casts of a video game ever, and getting to see new sides of them as they're all a bit older and out on their own for a change is really cool. The gameplay is fantastic, the story is fun. Really, this is just a phenomenal follow-up to one of the best RPGs of all time. The Trails games make up my favorite video game story of all time, so you knew there were going to be some Trails games on this list. The fact that any of them are this far back is just a testament to how amazing the past few years have been for RPGs. Trails from Zero is the start to the Crossbell arc, the duology of games that a lot of Trails fans consider to be their favorite. I don't know if I'd consider it my favorite, but I would never argue that it's not incredible. The Crossbell games star Lloyd Bannings, who joins a special task force with the Crossbell City Police. They're called the SSS, the Special Support Section. Zero, being the first half of the story, is really all about the setup. That means that you should go in expecting cliffhangers galore. But, fortunately for you, you can jump straight into the next game, which is Azure picks up where Zero left off, and it's really a huge emotional payoff. I probably can't say much about the story without spoiling things, so I'll just say that the Trails games are known for their stories, so you know it's going to be good. Gameplay-wise, the Crossbell games use an evolution of the system found in the original Trails in the Sky trilogy, where your characters can be moved around the battlefield and can use attacks, some of which are area-based, which makes positioning super important. It's by and large an old-school style of system, but the modern conveniences available like turbo mode make it significantly more enjoyable. The systems of arts, i.e. magic, and crafts, i.e. special attacks, are perfectly balanced so that you can sort of create your own preferred playstyle. I would still be in love with these games even if the gameplay wasn't good, so it's a huge bonus that they're so darn fun to play. If you haven't played any Trails games, the Crossbell arc is a great place to start, so don't put it off any longer and just get into it. If you haven't played any of the Ys games, there are at least a couple you really need to check out. One of them is Ys 8, which unfortunately isn't on this list because it's too old. But Ys 9, Monstrum Nox, which is the latest entry here in North America, is a worthy successor, and it's definitely worth your time. The Ys games star Adol, a red-haired dude who doesn't talk because of reasons, who goes on all sorts of adventures with his platonic pal Dogi. The games that Adol inhabits are some of the most satisfying action RPGs you're likely to ever play. Falcom isn't just a master of long-form storytelling with the Trails games, they're also kings of action combat. Ys 9 changes up the formula from its predecessors by essentially giving Adol and each of his party members unique skills, not just in battle, but in world traversal. This game is like Ys meets Marvel, as you're basically flying around, running up walls, and doing all sorts of superhuman things while you work to break the curse that's keeping you trapped in the city of Baltu. The story takes quite a few interesting turns, and for a series that's generally been known for its fun, but not overly complex storylines, it's quite a refreshing change of pace. The action is smoother than ever too, so if you're up for some button mashing battles, you definitely should check out Ys 9. I'm counting Super Mario RPG as eligible because this is far more than just your standard remaster. This is a from the ground up remake. And while it may be the most faithful video game remake of all time, it still manages to feel fresh as it reminds us oldies exactly why we love the original so much. Super Mario RPG The Legend of the Seven Stars was a sort of dream team mashup of Nintendo and Square, something no one could have seen coming back in the 90s. With state-of-the-art pre-rendered graphics and a turn-based battle system that incorporated timed button presses, it was the promising start to an entirely new franchise for Mario. Well, I guess actually it sort of started two franchises, but neither of those has ever quite lived up to the original. This remake is an extraordinary piece of work. Like I said, this is faithful to the original, almost to a fault, to the point that a lot of the dialogue is literally the same as it was back in the 90s. Not that that's a bad thing, the localization was top-notch back then too, but the graphical overhaul is stunning, and the musical upgrade is pretty great too. If you're not a fan of the new tunes though, the game does let you switch back to the original. How accommodating is that? Super Mario RPG is, I hope, the beginning of a new era of Mario RPGs. I'm totally fine with Paper Mario and the Mario and Luigi games continuing to exist, but I'd be thrilled if we saw more games that follow more closely in the footsteps of the original. If we all buy this, maybe that'll happen. No modern Final Fantasy game has escaped the bizarrely bitter criticisms of the Final Fantasy fanbase. 12 was too different, 13 was just a bunch of hallways, 14 was a broken MMO, 15 wasn't complete without a bunch of other media to fill in the gaps, and 16 is a full-on action game. But I've found a lot to love in most every Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy XVI ranking so high on this list should say a lot. I'm not heartless. I'll miss the old Final Fantasy as much as anyone. I'm glad turn-based games are still being made, and I do kind of wish we'd see more turn-based Final Fantasy, but that doesn't mean Final Fantasy XVI isn't worthy of the name. This game is dark and heavy. Its story deals with themes like slavery, disease, and hopelessness. It is not for the faint of heart. But if you're prepared for that kind of story, then the story of Final Fantasy XVI has to tell is one you'll remember for a long time. The hero is Clive, the prince of a kingdom who has the power to summon icons, which are essentially the traditional summon monsters from other games in the series. A mysterious force seems to be manipulating the world's governments to further some unknown end, and naturally Clive ends up in the thick of it. It's a much more political story than many others, probably even more political than Final Fantasy XII. And to be honest, those types of stories don't typically engage me. But this one did. I needed to see this story through, and not just the main story, but every side quest too. There are so many interesting characters and stories scattered all throughout this game. Yes, it's an action game now. Barely what we would consider an RPG in that traditional sense. But it's Final Fantasy all the way through. If you haven't, I would say give it a try. You might be surprised. Trails of Cold Steel 4 is the biggest and most epic chapter of the biggest and most epic arc of the Trails series. All of the world building, character building, stakes building has been done. We know every corner of the Erebonian Empire, from its major cities to its tiny villages. We've mastered the combat and we're more than ready for a new challenge. Trails of Cold Steel 4 enters the room and just completely overturns all our expectations. There are revelations in this game that had my jaw on the floor, and the fact a series that's been telling the same story for 9 entries at this point can still do that to me, that is astounding. This is the finest refinement of the Trails formula. The battles are fast and full of options, so you can play how you want and strategize to your heart's content. The cast of characters is so freaking big, you guys. It's like the Avengers Endgame of JRPGs. So many familiar faces from previous arcs show up, and in total, considering all the characters you'll have available at various points, there are 39 playable characters in this game. If you're a Trails newbie, that's gonna seem like way too many. I get it. But that's okay. You can take it slow with the Trails games. Get to know the characters through the other games, and by the time you reach the climax of the Cold Steel arc, you'll be so glad to see these people again. Take my word for it. I love the original Blue Reflection primarily because of its vibes. It radiates chill in a way that no other game I'd played ever did. The music was beautiful and suited the mood perfectly. The graphics were subtly enchanting, exemplified by the way the setting sun hits your character through a dirty high school window. Combat was engaging enough to carry me through the dungeons, which was the least I needed it to do. So Blue Reflection got good marks from me, even with its imperfections. Then Blue Reflection's Second Light came along and blew my expectations out of the water. It learned all the best lessons from the first game and improved on its predecessor in literally every way. More interesting characters, a more interesting story, much, much better and more engaging combat. The things that worked in the original continue to work in the sequel. The music, the graphics, the whole chill vibe. Second Light should be studied in schools as an exemplar for how to iterate on game design and how to rebuild from the ground up when necessary. The combat feels like more of a from the ground up sort of improvement. It's turn-based, but the action is basically non-stop, with a different button pulling up the menu for each of your 3 party members, and both characters and enemies constantly moving along the timeline at the bottom of the screen. Timing attacks in order to delay enemies becomes key, and so does learning how and when to defend in order to keep building up your damage multiplier. I haven't had this much raw fun with turn-based combat in ages. If you're in the mood for solid gameplay and just the chillest of vibes, then put Second Light on your list. It's one of the best games I've played in a long time. Final Fantasy VII is a really important game for a lot of people. For a bunch of fans, it was their introduction to the series and to JRPGs in general. For Square Enix, it was the game that truly launched them into superstardom. And for me, it was the most connected I'd ever felt to a cast of imaginary characters. I've loved the world and the lore of Final Fantasy VII since I was a kid. When Square decided to return to the world of Final Fantasy VII with Advent Children and the various spin-off games like Crisis Core, I was beyond thrilled. For a while after that movie and those games came out, it sort of seemed like maybe they were done with 7, and if that had been the case, I guess that would have been okay. But then, they gave us the thing we had all been asking for since the days of the PS2. They remade Final Fantasy VII. Well, sort of. Final Fantasy VII Remake walks the line between faithful retelling and revisionism. This is a story that's being retold by people who first told it years and years ago, when they were much younger creators. I can't fault them at all for wanting to revise a bit. In fact, the story shifts so much by the end that I don't see the word remake as an adjective. I see it as a verb. Even leaving the story out of the equation, the gameplay here is as different from the original as it could possibly be. The action combat feels so good to play, and the awesome way that time dramatically slows down but doesn't fully stop when you access a menu just oozes with cool. The performances from the actors are solid, and they really bring these characters to life in a way they've never been brought to life before. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a marvel of game design, and I couldn't possibly be more excited about Rebirth early next year. I don't know about you, but I'm definitely ready to continue the story. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 ended up touching me in ways that few games ever really have. This is due mostly to its characters. These 6 people feel more real to me than any other game characters I've ever encountered. It's not just the performances of the actors, though those do go a long way. It's the fact that Tetsuya Takahashi allows his characters to simply be with each other. They interact, they have conversations, sometimes about things that have nothing to do with the world-ending stakes they're facing. They feel things, and they tell each other how they feel about things. It's crazy to me that this seems so unique to Xenoblade 3, but it sort of is. The gameplay of Xenoblade 3 is also far and away the best of the series. I'll admit that I don't feel like I ever fully understood the combat in the first two Xenoblade Chronicles games, but Xenoblade 3 did the best job of explaining how everything works and refining the systems in such a way that they didn't feel cumbersome or confusing. Musically, this is probably the height of the Xenoblade series. Graphically, it definitely feels like the Switch is groaning under the weight of what Monolith Soft is asking of it, but it pulls everything off admirably. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, along with its absolutely necessary DLC, Future Redeemed, also finally answers a question that's sort of hung in the air for me for the last 20-ish years. And it proves Takahashi's dedication to telling a particular story in his way. It's a masterpiece. Omori is a difficult game to adequately and responsibly describe. It's challenging in ways that go beyond its combat. Its tonal shifts might leave you disoriented, where 1 minute you're battling a sentient audio tape, and the next you're having a heartbreaking conversation with a former friend who seems to have nothing but hatred for you now. But if you can find a way to absorb all of that, if you can sort of get used to the emotional whiplash you're likely to receive, then Omori absolutely gets my highest recommendation. In the simplest terms, Omori is a game clearly inspired by Earthbound, from its graphics to its music to its battles. But Omori is doing something else beyond just emulating a great game from the past. It's using the medium of video games to convey what it feels like to lose someone, and to lose yourself in grief, essentially. If you've recently dealt with a heavy loss, it might not be for you either. Unless experiencing fiction like this is the sort of thing that helps you cope. In a way, you could call this trigger warning the game and you wouldn't be too far off. But it doesn't wear that like a badge of honor. It's not some grimdark edgelord's idea of a good time. It's here to tell us a story and pass along a message. And it does this in one of the most unique ways I've ever seen a piece of media use. It's a difficult game to describe, but if my fumbling around for the right words has got you in any way intrigued, then I think you should check it out. It's not often that I add a game to my favorite games of all time list. In fact, there are points where I'm afraid I'll never add a game to that list again. The bar for quality keeps getting raised with each generation, and both game design and storytelling have gotten so good in video games that I have a hard time feeling like any particular game has really stood out in the way games used to. Games like Chrono Trigger and Xenogears leapt over the competition so clearly, so easily, that it's almost shocking. That doesn't happen much anymore. So yeah, I rarely feel like any game nowadays has a chance of getting on that list for me. Harvestella is on my list. It's funny because based on its initial Nintendo Direct trailer, I was the exact opposite of interested. It looked like a Rune Factory clone maybe, a sort of light fantasy action RPG with a big focus on farming. Definitely not my thing. But shortly after that trailer, I heard that Go Shina would be doing the music. Okay, now that got my attention. Go Shina is one of my favorite composers of all time. And if he was involved, then at the very least, that merited a second look. It's weird for me to say this, but that's the reason I pre-ordered the game, because I like the composer. I still didn't know anything about the story. I still didn't know if the combat would be fun. I still thought it was going to be a farming sim that would, at best, hook me for a short while, but quickly become repetitive. What I found when I sat down to play Harvestella was a game with a master's eye for design. This was not a big budget game. That much was obvious from the get-go. But the budget this team had was spent brilliantly. It doesn't matter that Harvestella doesn't have the highest polygon counts or the best shape. The world is so brilliantly and beautifully designed that it transcends its limitations. The characters you meet, both party members and NPCs, are so interesting and well designed, and their stories are almost universally so incredibly moving. The combat isn't overly complicated, and it likely won't blow your mind, but it's solid and it's fun, and that's all it needs to be. And the farming? The farming is minimal. I mean, it's there, you should do it. But this is not a farming sim by any stretch of the imagination. This is an action RPG with a plot far more intriguing than you're likely to believe. To me, it struck a chord that reminded me so much of games from the past, not in any tangible ways, but more sort of a gut feeling. And yes, the soundtrack is stunning. Harvestella is my favorite game of the last several years. It's one of my favorite games of all time. So that's it. My top 20 games for the 2020s so far. Once again, please let me know some of your favorites from the last several years down in the comments. I'd love to see where we match up, or maybe even find some games that you love that I haven't tried yet. If you've made it this far and you're not subscribed, would you mind subscribing? We do fun stuff like this all the time. I think you'll like it. And speaking of liking, could you? Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Until next time. Bye.